So have you thought recently, like, what's the difference between a good story and a great story? A mediocre story and a story that you can't help but tell your friends about. Like, I don't know, maybe this whole COVID-19 thing has given you more time to spend at home and just read all those books on the bookshelf that someone gave you a long time ago. You're like, I'm gonna read that someday. And now you're reading them all, right? We're just getting through all those books. Okay, maybe not. Maybe you're binging Netflix. Maybe you're catching up on those YouTube videos, or you're watching Disney Plus. I don't know. But what's the difference between a good story and a great story that you can't help but share with other people? May I suggest that all stories pretty much start the same. There's some conflict that needs to be resolved, but the difference between a good story and a great story is the way that they resolve it. And the good stories, okay, resolve in a way that's oftentimes predictable, but the great stories resolve it in a way that we didn't see it coming. It's surprising. It's unpredictable. Right, we've all seen the stories of the team that hasn't won a game in 10 years, and then they get a new coach, and they suffer through some adversity, and then the star player gets hurt, and get kicked off the team, and then they win the championship. It's like, I saw that one coming. But the great stories are the ones where like, man, I didn't think that person was going to be the hero of the story, or that person was going to be able to forgive that person. It was like, man, wow, I need to tell my friends about that story. And well, whether you know it or not, if you're following Jesus, you have a story that has the greatest plot twist in it ever. It's true. I mean, you read the Bible, and there's this narrative, okay, things are not good. Even though God created everything the way that they should be, okay, he placed his creation underneath our authority, but we don't trust God. And as our relationship with God breaks, everything in the world breaks. And all of a sudden there's this chaos, there's this evil that permeates all of our lives and our hearts and our relationships, and the Bible calls it sin, and God says, but don't worry, because I'm going to put things back to the way that it should be. Trust me, okay? And he begins unfolding this story. We see him unfolding it through the guy named Abraham. He says, I'm going to use your whole family to redeem the world, to bless the whole world. And they start building this relationship with God, and he gives them some rules to live by, and they realize, this is what it means to have a relationship with God, and we should love other people, and we should actually not just live for ourselves, and we should care for the poor and the oppressed, and care for our neighbors and love them. Okay, and they're getting to understand a little bit more about God. And then they want a king, and God says, okay, I'm going to use that desire for a king actually to send the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who is ultimately going to redeem the whole world. And he's going to be called the Messiah. And then Jesus shows up as the Messiah, and people are like, oh, you're the Messiah, then prove it. And he, does it. He starts healing people, and he starts, putting things the right side up. And he starts, hanging out with people that he shouldn't be hanging out with. And he starts loving people who shouldn't be loved. And all of a sudden, other people are like, okay, we don't really like that. And then he starts teaching some things that some people think are questionable, and then all of a sudden he starts messing with people's money and their security. He starts flipping over tables at the temple, and all of a sudden the religious leaders are like, we really don't like that, right? Because he's threatening their livelihood. And so all of a sudden Jesus ends up dead. And it's like the story's over. Jesus' disciples, they give up hope. They say, we've seen this story before. The Messiah comes, people follow him, and then all of a sudden he's dead, and all of the followers are dispersed. They disband, and nothing ever happens. I mean, that's what they think their story is. They think the story's over. But then Jesus rises from the dead, and there's this huge twist in the story that nobody saw coming, even though Jesus told his disciples this was coming. He says, guys, I'm going to die, and 3 days later I'm going to rise from the dead. But they totally oblivious, totally didn't see it. Okay, right over their heads. But then Jesus comes back from the grave and says, okay, guys, I saw this coming. This was the way it was supposed to be. I was going to die. All this sin, all this brokenness, all this evil was going to be placed on my shoulders. I was going to be buried underneath it, but I was going to stay there. I rose from the dead so that you don't have to stay there either. But you can find freedom from these addictions, from these, all this evil, all this destruction that our lives are permeated by, all this hurt, all these bad habits. Okay, you don't have to live in that any longer because of what I've done for you, because I have taken your punishment on the cross. But nobody saw that coming. And even Jesus' disciples after the resurrection are still kind of uncertain as to okay, so where are we going? What is this storyline? What's going on here? And so Jesus is getting ready to go back to heaven, and the disciples are like, so is it at this point you're going to be king and restore the kingdom to Israel, and we're going to be in charge here, and this is going to be good, right? This now? And Jesus says, no. And actually, I don't think the way that you think is going to happen is exactly how it's going to happen, and it's not for you to know exactly when that's going to happen. And well, you need to stay here in Jerusalem, and you're going to receive power from the Holy Spirit, and he's going to tell you what to do next. Okay, so just hold your horses. Then you're going to tell everybody about me. And so that's what they do. They wait in Jerusalem, and then the Holy Spirit comes and gives them the ability to teach people about Jesus, and teaches them, okay, guys, this is not exactly how we thought the story was going to unfold, but here's the deal. God has redeemed the world through Jesus by him going to the cross, by raising him from the dead, and actually you can't like earn it. You can't deserve it. Like, it's not going to be yours to take by being a religious person or being really good. Okay, it's actually only through God's grace and his love for you that you can now partake in this kingdom. Okay, didn't see it coming though. Okay, didn't see it coming. And so that's why in the New Testament, the authors of the New Testament oftentimes describe this good news as a mystery, as something that was once hidden that now has been made known. It was a total mystery that it would be only by God's grace and what Jesus has done for us on the cross that we could have a restored relationship with God, that things in this world could be made right again. It was a total mystery that this whole gospel, this whole good news was going to be for all people, not just for Jewish people, not just based upon where you were born or your last name or how good you are. It's for all people, no matter where you've been, no matter what you've done. It's for you. And nobody saw that coming. And yet God, all throughout the Bible, all throughout our story, has just always been in the business of twisting the plot, of doing things that were kind of unpredictable, of working in ways that we couldn't always see, and yet he was always working. Like in Joseph's story, in the Old Testament, when he's sold into slavery by his brothers, and he ends up in this pit, and we think his story is done. But God is with him, and then he is sold into slavery, and then he rises to power in Potiphar's house, and then he's thrown into jail. No, this isn't good. This isn't the way it's supposed to go, but God's with him, and then all of a sudden he rises to power in Egypt. He gets out of jail, he becomes second in command, and he, because of God's vision, he knows a famine is coming, so he stores up all this grain for when the famine comes. And then who shows up in need of grain when they're going through a famine? It's his brothers. His brothers who had sold him into slavery so many years ago, and they show up, and he reveals himself to them, and they think they're dead. They're shaking in their sandals. But Joseph says, hey brothers, understand. Don't be afraid. Understand, you intended to harm me. He says this in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, for the saving of many lives. Yes, but God. But God. He twisted the plot. We thought, okay, this is the way it's going to happen. I don't know what's going on in your life today. Maybe you had plans for your life. You had plans for a career. You had plans for, what you were going to do, but something changed. And understand, hey, God's bigger than it. And he can work in this hard time to redeem this situation. And like he's done maybe in the past, right? Because if you're a follower of Jesus, you have a but God moment already of when you went from living for yourself to living for God and living for other people, where you went from being shackled in these addictions, in these sins, to finding freedom in the grace of God. The Apostle Paul describes it. This but God, this transition, this twist in the plot moment in Ephesians chapter 2. It says, hey, among them we formerly lived. He says, in the lust of our flesh, indulging in the desires of the flesh and of the mind. Okay, we once lived that way for ourselves, in sin, and all is evil. He says, we were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest of the world. Our world was a mess. Our life was a mess. He says, but God, in the midst of the mess, in the midst of the hardship, but God, being rich in mercy because of his great love for us, with which he has loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Christ. Yes, Paul will say the same thing in Romans chapter 5, where he says, hey, but God. But God. He says, hey, in Romans chapter 5, he says, very rarely will somebody die for a righteous person. Though somebody might die for a good person. We see that story all the time. The Hacksaw Ridges, the person who lays down his life, who risks his life for good people. But Paul says in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Yeah, while we were enemies in our minds because of our with God, because of our evil behavior, because of our sin, because of our selfishness, man, God changed our story. He came down to die for us so that we would no longer live for ourselves, so that we would no longer build our lives upon a foundation that is oftentimes so shaky. Maybe COVID-19 has kind of reminded us of how shaky the foundations of things of this world can be: a career, our health, relationships. Man, the only solid foundations to build your life upon is God's love for you. What he's done for you is on the cross, his blood, his righteousness that we can have, not because of anything we can do, but because of what God has done for us. And so, what is your but God story? What is that story in your life where you can say, I was once anxious, I was once depressed, but God rescued me from that darkness and gave me new life and new hope? Or I had hit rock bottom, I had built my life upon sinking sand, but God redeemed me. He turned my life around and gave me a new purpose to share his love with other people. I don't know what your but God, what your twist in the plot story is, but if you're a follower of Jesus, you've got one. And it's too good to keep to yourself. So think about what is that story, and think about this week who you can share it with.